The morning sun barely filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 5B as people shuffled in through the heavy oak doors. It was just another Tuesday at the county courthouse, the kind of day where routine and procedure ruled everything. Lawyers clutched their briefcases, defendants sat nervously with their families, and court staff moved about with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this 1,000 times before. Officer Davis stood by the side wall, his arms crossed over his chest, eyes scanning the room with the intensity of someone who took his job very seriously. After 15 years on the force and 3 years assigned to courthouse security, he prided himself on knowing every rule, every protocol, and every inch of this building. Nothing happened in his courtroom without his knowledge. At least that's what he believed. The clock on the wall read 8:45. Court wouldn't officially start until 9, but Davis liked these quiet moments before the chaos began. He watched as the court clerk, Patricia, organized files at her desk. The bailiff, Rodriguez, checked his equipment near the judge's bench. Everything was falling into place like it did every single day. Then he saw her. A woman in her late 40s walked through the side entrance, the one typically reserved for court staff and judges. She wore dark slacks and a blazer, nothing fancy, but she carried herself with a certain presence that made her stand out. In her hands were several manila folders and what looked like a leather notebook. She walked straight toward the judge's bench without hesitation, as if she belonged there. Davis felt his jaw tighten. This wasn't right. Civilians didn't just wander behind the bench. They didn't handle court documents. They certainly didn't act like they owned the place. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice sharp and commanding. "Ma'am, you need to step away from there right now." The woman glanced up briefly, made eye contact with him for just a second, then returned her attention to the papers in her hands. She seemed completely unbothered by his command, which only irritated Davis more. He pushed off from the wall and walked toward her with purposeful steps, his hand instinctively moving near his belt where his radio sat. Several people in the gallery turned to watch, sensing that something unusual was happening. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Davis said louder this time, his voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. "That's a restricted area. You cannot be back there. Step away from the bench immediately." The woman looked up again, this time holding his gaze a bit longer. Her expression remained calm, almost neutral, showing neither fear nor defiance. She didn't say a word. She simply continued organizing the documents on the bench surface as if Davis hadn't spoken at all. This was unacceptable. Davis had dealt with difficult people before, people who thought rules didn't apply to them, people who believed they could do whatever they wanted. But this was different. This was his courtroom, and he wouldn't tolerate anyone compromising its security or dignity. "Ma'am, I will not ask you again," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge as he moved closer. "You need to move back to the public seating area right now, or I will have you removed from this courtroom. Do you understand me?" A few lawyers who had been chatting near the front row stopped their conversation. Patricia, the court clerk, looked up from her files with wide eyes. Rodriguez, the bailiff, shifted uncomfortably near the witness stand, his face showing an expression that Davis would later recognize as alarm. But in that moment, Davis was too focused on the woman to notice these reactions. He was doing his job, maintaining order, protecting the sanctity of the court. At least that's what he told himself. "I don't know who you think you are or what you think you're doing," Davis continued, his frustration building with each passing second. "But this is a court of law, not your personal office. Nobody, and I mean nobody, gets to waltz in here and treat this bench like it's their desk at home." The woman finally stopped what she was doing. She looked directly at Davis, and for a brief moment he saw something in her eyes. It wasn't anger or intimidation. It was something else entirely, something he couldn't quite place. Knowledge, maybe, or perhaps patience wearing thin. She gathered her papers slowly, methodically, as if she had all the time in the world. Then, without speaking a single word, she walked toward the side door she had originally entered through. Her movements were measured and deliberate, showing no signs of hurry or distress. Davis felt a small sense of victory. He had maintained order. He had protected the integrity of the courtroom. He had done his job exactly as he was trained to do. He turned back toward his usual position by the wall, satisfied that he had handled the situation professionally and effectively. But something felt off. The atmosphere in the courtroom had changed in a way he couldn't quite identify. Patricia was staring at her desk, suddenly very interested in a stack of papers that hadn't seemed important moments before. Rodriguez kept glancing between Davis and the side door, his expression somewhere between concern and second-hand embarrassment. "What?" Davis said to Rodriguez, his voice lower now but still carrying a defensive tone. "She shouldn't have been there. I was just enforcing the rules." Rodriguez opened his mouth as if to say something, then seemed to think better of it. He simply shook his head slightly and turned his attention back to his duties. But Davis could see the tension in his shoulders. Another officer, Thompson, who had been standing near the main entrance, walked over to Davis. Thompson had worked courthouse security for less than a year, and he usually looked up to Davis as a mentor. But now his face showed something different. Concern, maybe. Or was it pity? "Hey, Davis," Thompson said quietly, leaning in so others wouldn't hear. Did you check your email this morning? About the new assignments?" Davis frowned. "No, why? What does that have to do with anything? I just stopped someone from contaminating a secured area. That's literally our job." Thompson winced and glanced toward the side door where the woman had disappeared. "Yeah, about that." But before Thompson could finish his sentence, Rodriguez stepped forward to the center of the courtroom. His voice boomed out with the authority of someone making an official announcement, the kind that demanded everyone's immediate attention. "All rise." Davis straightened automatically, his training kicking in. Everyone in the courtroom stood. Conversation ceased and the shuffling of papers stopped. This was the moment that happened every single day, multiple times a day. The moment when the judge entered and court officially began. The Honorable Judge Victoria Holloway presiding. Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying through every corner of the room. The side door opened and Davis felt his entire body go rigid. His heart, which had been beating normally just seconds before, suddenly felt like it might pound straight through his chest. His mouth went dry and a cold sensation started at the base of his neck and spread down his spine. Walking through that door, wearing the unmistakable black robe of a judge, was the woman he had just yelled at. The woman he had ordered around like she was some confused civilian who had wandered into the wrong place. The woman who had remained silent through his entire tirade, not because she was intimidated, but because she simply chose not to engage. Judge Holloway moved to the bench with the same calm, measured steps she had used before. She ascended to her seat, arranged her robe, and placed those same manila folders in front of her with practiced precision. Davis couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He could only stand there, frozen, as the full weight of what he had done crashed down on him like a tidal wave. This wasn't just any judge. This was apparently the new judge assigned to courtroom 5B, the judge he would be working with every single day, the judge whose authority he had just completely, utterly, and spectacularly undermined. Time seemed to slow down as Davis watched Judge Holloway settle into her seat. The sound of fabric rustling as people sat back down felt amplified in his ears. His legs moved automatically, lowering him into a standing position against the wall, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. It was replaying every word he had said, every harsh tone he had used, every aggressive gesture he had made. "You need to step away from there right now." "Hey, I'm talking to you. I will have you removed from this courtroom." Each phrase echoed in his memory like a recording he couldn't shut off. His face felt hot, and he was suddenly very aware of the uniform he wore, the badge on his chest that was supposed to represent professionalism and respect. He had just shown neither Thompson, standing next to him, kept his eyes forward but whispered under his breath, "I tried to tell you, man." Davis couldn't respond. His throat felt tight, like someone had wrapped a hand around it. He watched as Judge Holloway opened one of her folders and began scanning the contents with the same calm efficiency she had shown earlier. She didn't look angry. She didn't look upset. Somehow that made everything worse. If she had yelled back at him, if she had shown some emotion, maybe he could have understood how to process this moment. But her composure made him feel small, foolish, and completely out of his depth. Patricia, the court clerk, began calling out the day's schedule, her voice shakier than usual. "Your Honor, we have 23 cases on the docket today. The first matter is case number 7749, State versus—" "Thank you, Patricia," Judge Holloway interrupted gently. "Before we begin with the scheduled cases, I'd like to take a moment to introduce myself properly." The room fell into an even deeper silence. Davis felt several pairs of eyes drift in his direction before quickly looking away. He wanted to disappear into the wall behind him. He wanted to be anywhere but here. Judge Holloway looked out over the courtroom, her gaze sweeping across the lawyers, the defendants, the family members in the gallery, and the court staff. When her eyes passed over Davis, they didn't linger any longer than they did on anyone else. But he felt the weight of that brief glance all the same. "My name is Victoria Holloway, and as of this week I've been assigned to preside over Courtroom 5B, she began, her voice clear and steady. "I spent the last 8 years in district court handling civil litigation, but I've returned to criminal court because this is where I began my career as a judge, and it's the work I find most meaningful." She paused, allowing her words to settle. Several lawyers in the front row nodded respectfully. One older attorney, who looked like he'd been practicing law since before Davis was born, smiled with what appeared to be recognition. Maybe he had appeared before Judge Holloway years ago. "I believe in running an efficient courtroom," the judge continued. "I believe in fairness, in listening carefully to both sides, and in making decisions based on law and evidence, not emotions or assumptions. I also believe in respect. Respect for this institution, respect for the law, and respect for every single person who walks through that door." Davis felt his stomach twist. Was she talking about him? Was this entire speech directed at his behavior? He glanced at Thompson, who kept his expression carefully neutral. "I like to arrive early," Judge Holloway said, and now Davis was certain she was addressing what had happened. "I like to familiarize myself with the space, review my notes, and prepare for the day ahead. Some judges prefer to arrive right at 9 o'clock sharp. I prefer to be here at 8:30. That's simply my style." She looked down at her papers, made a small notation with her pen, then looked back up. "Now, I understand that my early arrival this morning caused some confusion. That's understandable. This courtroom had a different judge for the past 6 years, and change always takes adjustment." Several people shifted in their seats. Davis noticed that Rodriguez, the bailiff, had relaxed his shoulders slightly. Maybe this wasn't going to be as bad as he feared. Maybe the judge would just move on and pretend nothing had happened. Maybe, however, Judge Holloway continued, and that single word shattered Davis's brief moment of hope. "What happened this morning brings up an important point that I think everyone in this room should consider. Here it comes," Davis thought. The public humiliation, the formal reprimand, the beginning of the end of his courthouse assignment. He had worked so hard to get this position. Courthouse security was considered a good detail, better than walking beats in dangerous neighborhoods or dealing with traffic accidents. And he had just thrown it all away because he couldn't control his temper for 5 minutes. "Assumptions," the judge said, letting the word hang in the air. "We all make them. Every single day, we look at a person and make instant judgments about who they are, what they're doing, whether they belong somewhere or not. It's human nature. Our brains are wired to make quick assessments because throughout human history, those quick assessments kept us safe." She leaned forward slightly, her hands folded on the bench in front of her. "But we're not living in caves anymore. We're living in a society built on laws, procedures, and the principle that everyone deserves to be treated with a baseline level of dignity and respect until they prove otherwise." Davis could feel sweat forming under his collar. His partner from yesterday's shift had warned him about being too aggressive with people. "You catch more flies with honey," Officer Williams had said while they were doing rounds. Davis had brushed it off, insisting that firmness was what kept order. Now those words came back to haunt him. "This morning," Judge Holloway continued, her tone remaining even and measured, "someone in this courtroom made an assumption about me based on what they saw. They saw someone they didn't recognize in an area they considered restricted, and they responded in a way they believed was appropriate for maintaining security." She wasn't saying his name, but she might as well have been pointing directly at him. Everyone knew who she was talking about. Davis could feel the heat radiating from his face. He stared at a spot on the wall across from him, trying to maintain some semblance of professional composure even as he crumbled inside. The intention wasn't wrong, the judge said, and Davis's eyes snapped back to her face. Was she actually defending him? Security is important. Protecting the integrity of this courtroom is important. Making sure that unauthorized people don't access restricted areas is absolutely part of what keeps our court system functioning properly. Davis felt a tiny flicker of something that might have been relief, but it was immediately extinguished by what came next. But the execution was flawed. Judge Holloway said, her voice taking on a slightly firmer quality. Because the assumption was made before any questions were asked. The conclusion was reached before any facts were gathered. And that's a problem. That's a problem in law enforcement, it's a problem in the legal system, and it's a problem in life. She looked around the room again, making sure everyone was paying attention. They were. You could have heard a pin drop in that courtroom. I want everyone here to understand something, she said. I'm not interested in embarrassing anyone. I'm not interested in punishment for its own sake. What I am interested in is growth, learning, and becoming better versions of ourselves. We all have room for improvement. Myself included, Davis didn't know what to feel. Part of him was grateful that she wasn't dragging him through the mud in front of everyone. Another part of him almost wished she would, just to get it over with. This middle ground, this thoughtful approach, somehow made him feel worse because it highlighted just how poorly he had handled the situation. So, here's what I expect moving forward, Judge Holloway said, straightening some papers in front of her. I expect questions before commands. I expect professional courtesy before aggressive posturing. I expect that everyone in this courtroom, from the lawyers to the officers to the defendants themselves, will be given the benefit of the doubt until circumstances prove otherwise. She paused, her eyes moving deliberately across the room until they landed on Davis. This time they stayed there. Not in anger, not in accusation, but in expectation. Officer Davis, she said, and hearing his name from her lips made his blood run cold. Please approach the bench. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Davis felt his legs move, carrying him forward even though every instinct told him to run in the opposite direction. The walk from the wall to the judge's bench felt like miles instead of feet. Every step echoed in his ears. Every eye tracked his movement. When he reached the bench, he stood at attention, his hands clasped behind his back in the formal position he'd been taught at the academy. He looked up at Judge Holloway, and for the first time that morning he truly saw her, not as an obstacle or a problem or a civilian out of place, but as a person he had disrespected, a person who held his professional future in her hands. Standing before Judge Holloway, Davis felt like he was back in elementary school, called to the principal's office after getting caught doing something he knew was wrong. Except this was worse, much worse, because he was a grown man, a trained law enforcement officer, and he had just humiliated himself in front of an entire courtroom full of people who expected him to be a professional. Judge Holloway looked at him for a long moment. Not with anger, which somehow would have been easier to handle. Not with disgust or disappointment either. Her expression was thoughtful, measuring as if she was trying to decide something important. The silence stretched between them, and Davis became acutely aware of every sound in the room. The shuffling of someone's feet, the quiet creak of a bench as someone shifted their weight, the distant hum of the ventilation system overhead. Officer Davis, she finally said, her voice low enough that only he, Rodriguez the bailiff, and Patricia the court clerk could hear clearly. How long have you been working courthouse security? The question caught him off guard. He had expected an immediate reprimand, maybe even a recommendation for disciplinary action. Instead, she was asking about his career. 3 years, Your Honor, he managed to say, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat. 3 years in the courthouse, 15 on the force total. Judge Holloway nodded slowly as if this information confirmed something she had already suspected. 15 years. That's a substantial career. You must have seen quite a bit in that time. Yes, ma'am, Davis replied, unsure where this conversation was heading. His hands, still clasped behind his back, were starting to sweat. And in those 15 years, especially in the 3 years you've worked here, have you found that most people respond better to aggression or to respectful inquiry? She asked. It was a trap. It had to be. But it was also a fair question, and Davis had been taught long ago that lying to a judge was one of the stupidest things anyone could do. He thought about all the situations he'd handled over the years. The domestic disputes, the traffic stops, the courthouse disruptions, the times when things had gone smoothly and the times when they had escalated into something worse. Respectful inquiry, Your Honor, he admitted quietly. Most of the time. Most of the time, she repeated, letting those words settle. So you know from your own experience that approaching someone with courtesy and professionalism tends to yield better results than immediately jumping to commands and threats. Davis nodded, feeling his face burn with embarrassment. Yes, Your Honor. Then help me understand something, Judge Holloway said, leaning forward slightly. When you saw me this morning reviewing documents at this bench, what specifically made you decide that aggression was the appropriate response? What about the situation suggested that I was a threat that needed to be immediately neutralized, rather than a person who might have a legitimate reason for being here? The question hit Davis like a physical blow, because the honest answer, the real answer, was that he hadn't thought at all. He had simply reacted. He had seen something that didn't fit his expectations, and instead of taking even 10 seconds to assess the situation properly, he had gone straight to enforcement mode. I don't have a good answer for that, Your Honor, he said, forcing himself to maintain eye contact. Even though it was one of the hardest things he'd ever done, I saw someone I didn't recognize in a restricted area, and I reacted without thinking, without asking questions, without gathering any information at all. Without thinking, Judge Holloway repeated. That's an honest answer, Officer Davis, and I appreciate honesty. But it's also a concerning answer, because officers who don't think before they act are officers who create problems instead of solving them. Davis felt his jaw tighten, but he knew she was right. Completely, undeniably right. He thought about all the times he'd criticized other officers for acting rashly. All the times he'd prided himself on being better, more controlled, more professional. And then this morning, he had done exactly what he'd always condemned others for doing. I've reviewed the personnel files for all the officers assigned to this courtroom, Judge Holloway continued, and Davis felt a fresh wave of anxiety wash over him. She had done her homework. Of course she had. Your record is solid. Commendations for de-escalation. Recognition for community service. A generally positive reputation among your peers and supervisors. She paused, tapping her pen lightly against the folder in front of her, which makes this morning even more puzzling. Because the officer described in these files doesn't match the officer who yelled at me 30 minutes ago. So I have to wonder which version is the real you and which version was the anomaly. Davis swallowed hard. It was a fair question, and it demanded a real answer, not an excuse, not a justification, just the truth. The officer in those files is who I try to be, Your Honor, he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. This morning was me at my worst. I was overconfident. I made assumptions, and I let my ego get in the way of doing my job properly. He took a breath, knowing that what he was about to say might not help his situation, but needing to say it anyway. There's no excuse for how I spoke to you. None. And I understand if you want to request that I be reassigned or if you want to file a formal complaint. I deserve it. Judge Holloway studied him for another long moment, and Davis could practically see the wheels turning in her head. She was a judge, trained to evaluate people, to assess credibility, to determine truth from deception. Whatever she saw in his face right now would determine his future in this courthouse. Do you know why I didn't identify myself when you first approached me? She asked suddenly. Davis blinked, confused by the change in direction. No, Your Honor. Because I wanted to see what you would do, she said simply. I wanted to see if you would ask questions, if you would attempt to gather information, if you would treat me with the basic respect that any person deserves, regardless of whether they're a judge or a janitor or someone lost looking for the bathroom. She sat back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her face. What I saw disappointed me, Officer Davis, but what I'm hearing right now gives me hope. Because you're not making excuses. You're not trying to justify your behavior. You're taking responsibility for it. That matters. Davis felt something shift inside him. Not relief exactly, but maybe the smallest possibility that this disaster might not completely destroy everything he'd worked for. Here's what I want you to understand, Judge Holloway continued, her voice taking on a tone that was both firm and somehow compassionate. This courtroom is going to see some of the most vulnerable people in our community walk through those doors. Defendants who are scared, victims who are traumatized, families who are desperate, and every single one of them is going to be watching how we treat people, how you treat people. She gestured around the courtroom, encompassing everyone present. We set the tone in here. The judge, the lawyers, the bailiff, the officers, the clerks, all of us. And if we set a tone of aggression, of assumption, of guilty until proven innocent, then we've failed. We've failed the law, we've failed justice, and we've failed the people we're supposed to serve. Davis felt the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. She wasn't wrong. He had seen it himself over the years. The way people responded to the atmosphere in a courtroom. The way they opened up when they felt safe and shut down when they felt threatened. So here's my decision, Judge Holloway said, and Davis braced himself. I'm not going to request your reassignment. I'm not going to file a formal complaint. What I'm going to do is ask you to be better, to be the officer described in those personnel files, to be someone who thinks before acting, who asks before assuming, and who treats every single person who enters this courtroom with dignity." She leaned forward again, her eyes locking with his. "Can you do that for me, Officer Davis? Can you be that person?" Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by a fierce determination not to disappoint this woman who was showing him grace he absolutely did not deserve. "Yes, Your Honor, I can. I will." "Good," Judge Holloway said, a hint of a smile touching the corners of her mouth. "Because I expect excellence from everyone in this courtroom, including myself. And I have a feeling that you're capable of excellence when you get out of your own way." She made a small gesture, indicating that he could return to his position. "Now let's begin our day properly. We have 23 cases to get through, and I'd like to make sure everyone gets the attention they deserve." Davis stepped back from the bench, his legs feeling shaky but his mind clearer than it had been all morning. As he walked back to his position by the wall, he caught Thompson's eye. His fellow officer gave him a small nod, the kind that said without words, "You dodged a bullet, don't waste it," and Davis had no intention of wasting it. As Judge Holloway began addressing the first case on the docket, he stood straighter, paid closer attention, and made himself a silent promise that he would never again let his ego overrule his training. The rest of that first morning passed in a blur for Davis. He watched Judge Holloway work through case after case with a combination of efficiency and genuine care that he hadn't seen in many judges. She listened carefully to each defendant, asked thoughtful questions, and made decisions that seemed to balance justice with humanity. When a young woman broke down crying over a traffic violation she couldn't afford to pay, the judge didn't just dismiss her emotions. She asked about her circumstances, learned she was a single mother working 2 jobs, and arranged a payment plan that wouldn't destroy her financially. Davis found himself paying attention in a way he never had before. Usually, court proceedings were just background noise to him. His job was security, not justice. But today something had shifted. Maybe it was the embarrassment of the morning still burning in his chest, or maybe it was the way Judge Holloway had given him a second chance when she could have easily ended his courthouse career with a single phone call. When the lunch recess finally came, Davis stayed at his post while others filtered out. Thompson grabbed his arm on the way past. "You okay, man?" Thompson asked, his voice low and concerned. "Yeah," Davis replied, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Just thinking." "Listen, don't beat yourself up too much," Thompson said. "We've all had bad days. The important thing is you learn from it, right?" Davis nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a bad day. It was a wake-up call, and he needed to figure out what to do with it. The afternoon session started at 1:30, and Davis made a conscious effort to approach his duties differently. When an older man wandered too close to the witness stand, instead of barking at him, Davis walked over calmly. "Excuse me, sir. Can I help you find something?" he asked, his tone polite and professional. The man looked confused, holding a piece of paper in his shaking hands. "I'm looking for courtroom 5B. I have a hearing, but I've never been here before, and everything looks the same." "You're in the right place," Davis assured him, guiding him gently toward the gallery seating. "Your case will be called when it's time. Just have a seat here and listen for your The man's face flooded with relief. "Thank you, officer. I was worried I'd gotten lost." It was such a small interaction, the kind that happened a dozen times a day. But Davis noticed Judge Holloway glance up from her paperwork, catching the exchange. She didn't say anything, but something in her expression suggested approval, and that tiny bit of recognition made Davis stand a little taller. The real test came about an hour later. A defendant named Robert Chen was called for a probation violation hearing. Chen was a regular in the courthouse, someone Davis had dealt with multiple times over the past year. He had a history of missing court dates, failing drug tests, and generally making things difficult for everyone involved in his case. Davis had never liked him, and the feeling seemed mutual. Chen shuffled into the courtroom wearing wrinkled clothes and an attitude that radiated hostility. As he walked past Davis toward the defendant's table, he muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like an insult. Every instinct in Davis's body wanted to respond, to assert his authority, to put Chen in his place. But he thought about Judge Holloway's words. about treating people with dignity, about not making assumptions, about being better, so Davis did nothing. He simply maintained his position and kept his expression neutral, even though it took more effort than he wanted to admit. The hearing didn't go well for Chen. His probation officer, Obin, testified that he had missed 3 appointments and tested positive for methamphetamine twice in the past month. Chen's lawyer tried to argue that his client was struggling with addiction and needed treatment. Not punishment, but the evidence was damning. Judge Holloway listened to everything carefully, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. When it was time for Chen to speak, she looked at him directly and asked, "Mr. Chen, do you have anything you'd like to say before I make my decision?" Chen slouched in his chair, arms crossed, his face a mask of defiance. "What's the point? You've already made up your mind. You're all the same. Nobody cares what happens to people like me." The courtroom went quiet. Davis had seen this kind of outburst before. Some judges would shut it down immediately, cite the defendant for contempt, make an example of them. He waited to see what Judge Holloway would do. She didn't react with anger or impatience. Instead, she set down her pen and gave Chen her full attention. "Actually, Mr. Chen, I haven't made up my mind yet. That's why I'm asking for your perspective. This is your opportunity to help me understand your situation." Chen looked surprised, as if he hadn't expected that response. For a moment, his defensive posture softened slightly. "I've been clean for 2 weeks," he said, his voice losing some of its edge. "I know that doesn't erase the positive tests, but I'm trying. It's just hard when nobody believes in you." "What's making it hard?" Judge Holloway asked, and it wasn't a rhetorical question. She genuinely seemed to want to know. "I lost my job," Chen admitted, "and my mom kicked me out because she's tired of my problems. I've been staying at the shelter, but there's people there who use, and it's hard to stay clean when that's all around you." Judge Holloway nodded slowly, processing this information. "Mr. Chen, I appreciate your honesty. Addiction is a disease, and recovery is difficult under the best circumstances. But you were given probation instead of jail time with the understanding that you would comply with certain conditions. You haven't done that." Chen's face hardened again, as if he was preparing for the inevitable bad news. "However," Judge Holloway continued, and that single word made everyone in the courtroom pay closer attention, "I'm not interested in setting you up to fail. What I am interested in is giving you the tools you need to succeed, if you're willing to use them." She pulled out a different folder and scanned through it quickly. "I'm going to order you into a residential treatment program, 30 days full-time. You'll have housing, structure, counseling, and you'll be separated from the environments that are making it difficult for you to stay clean." Chen blinked, clearly not expecting this. "Residential? I thought those programs were full. I tried to get in one 6 months ago and they said there was a waiting list." "There usually is," Judge Holloway agreed. "But I have some connections and I'm willing to make some calls on your behalf. The question is, are you willing to do the work? Because if I arrange this and you walk out after 3 days, we're done. You'll serve the remainder of your sentence in jail. Do you understand?" For the first time since entering the courtroom, Chen sat up straighter. "Yes, ma'am. I understand. And I won't waste it. I promise." "Good," Judge Holloway said firmly. "Because I'm choosing to believe in you, Mr. Chen. Don't make me regret it." As Chen was led out by his probation officer to discuss the logistics of the treatment program, Davis saw something he hadn't seen before. Hope. Real, genuine hope in the eyes of someone who had walked in expecting nothing but more punishment. After the courtroom cleared for the day and Judge Holloway disappeared into her chambers, Rodriguez came over to where Davis was gathering his things. "You did good today," the bailiff said, clapping him on the shoulder. "After this morning, I wasn't sure how things would go, but you handled yourself well." "Thanks," Davis said, meaning it. "I've got a lot to learn." "We all do," Rodriguez replied. "That's the thing about working for Judge Holloway. She expects growth. From everyone, including herself." As Davis walked to his car that evening, he thought about everything that had happened. The morning's disaster. The judge's grace. The way she had shown him what real leadership looked like. And that moment with Chen, when she had looked past the attitude and the failures to see a person who needed help. Not just punishment. He pulled out his phone and sent a text to his supervisor. "Need to talk to you about some ideas for improving how we interact with people in the courthouse. Let me know when you have time." It was a small step, but it was a start. And as Davis drove home through the evening traffic, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not just relief at surviving a terrible day, but genuine excitement about going back to work tomorrow and being better than he had been today. Judge Holloway had given him a gift that morning, even though he hadn't deserved it. She had given him the chance to prove he was more than his worst moment, and he was determined not to waste it. 3 months had passed since that terrible morning when Davis had yelled at Judge Holloway. 3 months that had changed everything about how he approached his job, his colleagues, and the people who came through the courthouse doors every single day. The changes hadn't happened overnight. Breaking old habits never did. There were days when he caught himself about to snap at someone, days when his first instinct was still to bark orders rather than ask questions, but each time he would pause, take a breath, and remember the patient way Judge Holloway had dealt with him when he deserved so much worse. His supervisor had been surprised by the text Davis sent that first evening, but he had been even more surprised by the detailed proposal Davis submitted a week later. Ideas for de-escalation training, suggestions for how courthouse security could be more welcoming without compromising safety, ways to help people who were navigating the confusing court system for the first time. Some of the older officers had rolled their eyes at what they called Davis's sudden, soft approach. But others, especially the younger ones like Thompson, had embraced it. And the results spoke for themselves. Fewer confrontations, fewer complaints, a general sense that Courtroom 5B was becoming a place where people felt heard rather than just processed. On this particular morning, Davis arrived at his usual time to find Judge Holloway already in her chambers. Through the small window in the door, he could see her reviewing files just as she did every single day. He knocked softly and she looked up, waving him in. "Good morning, Officer Davis," she said with a slight smile. "You're here early." "Good morning, Your Honor. I wanted to talk to you about something before court starts, if you have a minute." She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Of course, what's on your mind?" Davis sat down, suddenly feeling nervous even though he had rehearsed this conversation in his head a dozen times. "I wanted to thank you for what you did 3 months ago, for giving me a second chance when you could have easily gotten me reassigned or worse." Judge Holloway set down her pen and gave him her full attention, just as she always did when someone was speaking to her. "You're welcome, but you're the one who took that second chance and did something meaningful with it. That part was all you." "Maybe," Davis said, "but I wouldn't have had the opportunity if you hadn't shown me what real leadership looks like. The way you handled that morning, the way you handle every case that comes before you, it's changed how I see my role here." He pulled out a folder he had been carrying and placed it on her desk. "I wanted to show you something. Remember Robert Chen? The guy with the probation violation that first day?" Judge Holloway's expression brightened with recognition. "Of course, how's he doing?" "He completed the residential program," Davis said, unable to keep the pride out of his voice. 30 days turned into 60 because he asked to stay longer. He's been clean for 93 days now. He got a job at a warehouse and he's been showing up to every probation meeting early. He opened the folder and showed her a photo that Chen's probation officer had shared. It showed Chen at his job wearing a safety vest, giving a thumbs up to the camera. The difference between this person and the hostile, defeated man who had stood in her courtroom 3 months ago was remarkable. "He asked me to give you this," Davis said, handing her a handwritten letter. Judge Holloway took it carefully and began to read. Davis couldn't see what it said, but he watched her face soften as she read through it. When she finished, she set it down gently and looked up at Davis with eyes that were just slightly brighter than they had been a moment before. He says that day in court was the first time in years that someone in authority treated him like a person instead of a problem, she said quietly. "That's a powerful thing." "It is," Davis agreed. "And it made me realize something. That morning when I yelled at you, I wasn't treating you like a person either. I was treating you like a problem that needed to be solved. And I've been doing that to people for years without even realizing it." He leaned forward, his voice earnest. "But watching you work, seeing how you give everyone who comes into your courtroom genuine respect and attention, it's taught me that there's a better way. A way that actually helps people instead of just controlling them." Judge Holloway was quiet for a moment, and Davis wondered if he had said too much, gotten too personal. But then she smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Officer Davis, do you know why I didn't report you that morning?" she asked. "Because you're a better person than I deserved?" he offered with a self-deprecating smile. "No," she said, shaking her head. Because I saw something in you that you didn't see in yourself yet. I've been a judge long enough to recognize the difference between someone who's inherently cruel and someone who's simply fallen into bad habits. You were the latter, and people like that are worth investing in. She stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the courthouse grounds where people were beginning to arrive for the morning session. When I was a young public defender, I had a mentor who changed my life. I was aggressive, combative, so focused on winning that I forgot why I had gone into law in the first place. One day, after I had been particularly harsh with a witness, she pulled me aside and told me something I've never forgotten. Judge Holloway turned back to face Davis. She said, "Victoria, you can be right and still be wrong. You can win your case and still lose something more important. Never forget that the people in that courtroom are someone's daughter, someone's father, someone's last hope. Treat them accordingly." The words hung in the air between them, and Davis felt something shift in his chest. It was exactly what he had needed to hear, even though he hadn't known it until this moment. "That's what I try to do every day," Judge Holloway continued, "and that's what I saw the potential for in you. The question that morning wasn't whether you had made a mistake. You clearly had. The question was whether you were the kind of person who could learn from it." "I hope I've proven that I am," Davis said. "You have," she assured him. "More than proven it. You've become one of the best officers in this courthouse. People feel safe around you, but they also feel respected. That's a rare combination." There was a knock on the door, and Patricia poked her head in. "Your Honor, it's almost 9. The courtroom is filling up." "Thank you, Patricia." "We'll be right there," Judge Holloway said, then turned back to Davis. "Shall we go start our day?" As they walked toward the courtroom together, Davis felt a sense of purpose he had never experienced before in his 15 years on the force. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a calling, a chance to make a real difference in people's lives, one interaction at a time. The courtroom was already packed when they entered. Davis took his position by the wall, but this time he didn't see potential threats or problems waiting to happen. He saw people, nervous defendants hoping for a fair shake, worried family members looking for answers, lawyers preparing to advocate for their clients, all of them deserving of dignity and respect, regardless of why they were here. Rodriguez called the court to order, and Judge Holloway took her seat with the same calm confidence she displayed every single day. As the morning's first case was called, Davis noticed a young woman near the back who looked completely lost, clutching a piece of paper and glancing around frantically. He walked over quietly, careful not to startle her. "Good morning, ma'am. You look like you might need some help. Is there something I can assist you with?" The relief on her face was immediate. "Yes, please. This is my first time in court, and I don't know where I'm supposed to go or what I'm supposed to do." Davis spent the next 5 minutes patiently explaining the process, helping her understand when her case would be called, and assuring her that she wasn't going to mess anything up. By the time he was finished, her shoulders had relaxed and she actually smiled. "Thank you so much, officer. You have no idea how scared I was walking in here." "You're welcome," Davis said warmly. "That's what I'm here for. And don't worry. Judge Holloway is fair. Just be honest and respectful and everything will work out." As he returned to his position, he caught Judge Holloway's eye. She gave him the smallest nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that meant more to him than any formal commendation ever could. The morning proceeded smoothly, case after case handled with efficiency and care. During a brief recess, Thompson came over with a grin on his face. "Man, you've really changed," Thompson said. "Remember when you first started here? You were all about laying down the law and making sure everyone knew who was in charge." Davis laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Don't remind me. I cringe thinking about some of the things I did back then." "We all do stupid stuff when we're learning," Thompson said. "The important thing is you figured it out. And honestly, you've inspired some of the rest of us to be better too. That whole proposal you put together about de-escalation, Captain-approved funding for the training. We start next month." Davis felt a surge of satisfaction. Real change. Actual progress. It had all started with one humiliating moment that had forced him to take a hard look at himself and decide what kind of officer, what kind of person he wanted to be. As the day wound down and the last case was heard, Davis reflected on the journey of the past 3 months. He thought about Judge Holloway's grace, Chen's transformation, and his own evolution from someone who saw his job as enforcement to someone who understood it as service. That evening, as he was preparing to leave, Judge Holloway emerged from her chambers. "Officer Davis, could I speak with you for just a moment?" "Of course, Your Honor." She handed him an envelope. "I've written a letter of commendation for your personnel file. Your transformation these past 3 months has been remarkable, and it deserves to be recognized officially." Davis was speechless. He had never expected this, never even thought about formal recognition. The personal growth had been reward enough. "Thank you, Your Honor, that means more than you know." "You earned it," she said simply. "Now go home, rest, and come back tomorrow ready to keep making a difference." As Davis walked to his car that evening, he thought about the officer he had been and the officer he was becoming. The journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more moments where he would have to choose between the easy way and the right way, but now he knew which choice to make, and he had Judge Holloway's example to guide him whenever he forgot.